So, as Balin said, one of the policy issues that I deal with at CEI is beverage regulation, in particular alcohol, which most of you are enjoying right now. Like a lot of food products, the government doesn't usually go about direct bans on products. Usually what it does is nudging, taxing, making things more expensive or more difficult to come by in order to modify consumer behavior away from products that it thinks are bad for society or bad for the individual. Unfortunately, it was alcohol that really taught regulators the best lesson they probably ever learned, which is bans don't work, people don't like them, it raises alarm bells and they fight against them. Prohibition was the biggest one. People didn't like it. After that grand experiment, bans usually don't fly. So what they do is they go slow, thus the nudging, taxing, making things more difficult. But what this really does is it's death by 1,000 regulatory cuts. It makes it more expensive for consumers to get these products, and ultimately it kills a lot of businesses. And again, makes it more difficult for us to get the things that we would like to have. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to run down how alcohol is regulated in this country, and I'm trying to make it quick and not as dry as it possibly could be. And then I'm going to go through a couple examples of really egregious overreach, instances of overreach. And finally, I'll talk about some things that we're really keeping our eye on in regards to alcohol and beverage regulation, and what everybody in this room who wants to have access to really great alcohol, I'm sure you do, what you can do to make sure that we continue to have that access. First I'll go into, and I should note that I'm going to focus mostly on beer, just because the regulations are quite different on wine and liquor and beer, and just for the sake of brevity and clarity and personal preference, I'm going to go with beer. So the system of regulation that we have in this country was really set up after Prohibition, as you all know. The 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition, and it created a state-by-state regulatory system. So almost all the regulations regarding alcohol are state-based, which means it's really complicated, it's really different in every state, and it's constantly changing. Even someone like me who spends an hour or two every day following regulation cannot keep up with all the changes that are happening. So we're going to talk about various states and things that have happened. And I may not be right because something may have happened last week that I just didn't hear about. I suggest you all keep an eye on it. So we have a three-tiered system. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever heard that expression, three-tiered, anybody? But, okay, good, a few people. What it really means is the distribution of alcohol in the entire country, for almost all alcohol, is separated by the producer, brewer, a vineyard, a distiller. He sells to a wholesaler, middleman. And then that middleman will then sell to a store or a restaurant or a tavern. And it's a mandatory separation in almost all instances. The brewer cannot sell directly to a retail outlet by law. And this makes the wholesaler, the middleman, incredibly powerful. And this has been going on since Prohibition, and so it's not really too surprising that almost instantaneously the wholesalers became one of the most powerful lobby groups in the country with the most money, because they were involved in every single alcohol transaction that happened. And what they've been doing since the first day they had that power is throwing all of their weight and all of their money in front of any legislation that would chip away at that monopoly that they had. So we see in most states the story of the regulatory fight regarding alcohol is really the producer or the consumer fighting the wholesalers to get more access to the market. The purpose of that original separation was to prevent this idea of tied houses. Back before Prohibition, taverns were sometimes owned, at least in part, by the people who made the beer, and people thought that that incentivized the tavern owner to make their customers drink as much as possible. It was a flimsy argument, but it flew, and so that's the system that we're left with. So the state-based regulations, like I said, states regulate things like the percentage of alcohol that can be in beer, what can be on the labels, where it can be sold, when those stores can be open, etc. A lot of states still actually control the sale of alcohol, meaning that the state itself has stores run by state employees, and they purchase the alcohol and they sell to consumers. But there are some federal regulations. The TTB, that's the Tobacco and Alcohol Tax and Trade Bureau. That is the successor of ATF, which manages mostly licensing and labeling. There's a national label standard, and for most producers of beer, if they pass that test, if the TTB says your label's fine, that's the end of the story. Few states, though, like Texas, for example, which I'll talk about later, have a couple extra steps for brewers if they want to have their beer sold in the state. So that's the basic rundown. If you have any questions about any of these specific points, ask them in Q&A, because I can talk forever about this topic. More knowledge than I ever want. So a few instances of this system going completely awry and getting in the way of you and your beer. Sin taxes and minimum pricing. This sin taxes, you've probably heard this expression, is the idea that if you raise the price of alcohol, people won't drink as much. It doesn't really work that way. People just spend more money on beer and less money on other things that they need. For example, in Michigan, there's quite a few taxes. Taxes are different on beer, alcohol, and wine. I'm sorry, beer, spirits, and wine. And in Michigan, which is one of the 13 control states still, they control the purchasing and the sale of liquor. So no liquor comes into the state of Michigan that the state of Michigan didn't say comes in. And they set minimum pricing, which is actually really high. So if you go to another state, even one that's just neighboring, the price of whiskey, let's say Jack Daniels, is going to be cheaper than it's going to be in Michigan. This is the really fun one, percentage caps. A few states in this country still have caps on the amount of alcohol that can be in beer. For example, Mississippi has the privilege of having the lowest percentage cap on alcohol, which is 5% alcohol by weight, or about just a little over 6% alcohol by volume. Their beer cannot be higher than that in the state. Just to give you an example, a regular beer like DC Brow, for example, which is made in the city, in the District of Columbia, probably has around 5.5 alcohol. That's pretty standard. Light beers are a little lower, about 4. But craft beers, most of the craft beers that are made these days are above 5, above 6. Some go as high as 12. If you're talking about a barley wine, they go really high. And the people in Mississippi, let me tell you, that I've spoken to, especially the lovers of craft beer, are really pissed off that in their state they can't get anything higher than 6% alcohol by volume. Really all that means is they've created an intricate system of bootlegging, modern-day bootlegging in Mississippi. Luckily, people in that state are working hard to change those laws. Let's see. Blue laws, you've probably heard of blue laws as well. There's still plenty of states in this country. You may also know them as Sunday sales bans, but the scope is much bigger than that. There are still states that ban sales of alcohol on Election Day, plenty of states that ban sales on Sunday. There are still states that, in fact, many states ban the sales of alcohol on Christmas Day. I wrote a blog about this on my website, or my institute's website, openmarket.org, last Christmas, just detailing for people if they live in a state where they will not be able to buy alcohol on Christmas Day. Massachusetts and Connecticut have they get the gold medal because if Christmas falls on a Sunday, which it did this year, they also ban sales on the following Monday, which is awesome. That's great. I was just trying to give people a heads up on if they wanted to have, a drink with Christmas dinner, that they should get it earlier. 3.2 beer, you've probably heard as well. There's several states like Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado that allow beer in grocery stores, but it's capped at 3.2 alcohol by weight. So it's not really beer, and a lot of people in those states have been trying for years to get real beer in grocery stores. Colorado had a real fun fight with this for a couple years. When they failed again last year, they passed a law that said you must enforce all of the laws that are on the books in Colorado. Unfortunately, one of those laws meant that you couldn't sell light beer in taverns and restaurants. So Corona Light, Murphy's, I think it was Beamish, Irish Stout, a few of the lighter options were banned in bars for a short time in Colorado because they actually enforced the law. Of course, the governor overturned it very quickly as people were extremely angry. So those are a few of the specifics. I could get into a lot more. Texas is, ask me about Texas, I can go on for that for about an hour about their ridiculous laws, such as labeling laws and advertising. A few places have bans on where you can advertise and, for example, I'm going to go into it because I have to. It's just too aggravating. In Texas, you have to say if your beer goes above 5% alcohol, you have to call it a malt beverage or an ale. So if you're trying to get national distribution of your beer, your label better say that, otherwise you have to get a specific label made for Texas. Brooklyn Brewery shamed the hell out of Texas by putting on their Brooklyn Lager. It's Brooklyn Lager, except in Texas, it's a malt beverage. And they sold that throughout the entire country, not just for Texas. Okay, sure. So a few of the things we're keeping our eye on the national level, for example, the caffeine ban. I've got a bunch of Four Loko up here. I'm sure everybody in here has heard about Four Loko. Whereas the FDA didn't ban it, because it's a malt beverage that has 12% alcohol and caffeine. The FDA sent letters threatening letters to anybody who made that combo, and a few of them decided to change their formula, like Four Locos, to not have caffeine anymore. Now there's proposals by Senator Durbin to regulate caffeine in general in energy drinks, which will almost certainly escalate. And let's see. BPA, I'm sure a bunch of you heard the BPA scandal where the people asked the FDA to ban this particular coating of cans and plastics. If that actually happens, it would really hurt the craft beer movement because they are all about cans. Like I said, this is craft beer from DC, and it's very cheap, it's light, they can ship it easily. And nutritional labeling, again, to go with Michelle Obama, who's pushing the idea of nutritional labeling. For big breweries like Budweiser or Busch or Miller Coors, they don't care so much because they've only got a few beers that they would need to analyze and slap that on the label. They're good to go. Craft breweries make dozens of varieties of beer every year, and they change the cost to analyze and put a new label on all of their cans would be astronomical and prohibitive, which is why the big brewers aren't really making much of a fuss about this issue. So what can you do about all these things that the government's doing to get in between you and your beer? Really, mostly what they're doing is making them more expensive and killing small brewers. Well, you can come to things like AFF, where you can talk to people, learn a little bit about this. Mostly, I would suggest look at what's going on in your specific state, because it is a state-by-state, for the most part, regulatory scheme. And if you can fight the good fight in your own state, you can really make a difference. Like I said, in Mississippi, they've been trying for years to raise that cap, and just this last week, they actually had the legislature pass a bill that would raise the cap to 8% alcohol by weight, which is better. It's still not great, but now it's just waiting for the governor's signature. So change can happen, but it's at a local level. So, there you go.
Thanks, Michelle.